Hello and good evening, and welcome to the latest of Middle East Forum's webinars. My name is Jonathan Spire, and I'm the Director of Research at the Forum. And this evening, we're very lucky to have Catherine Perez-Shakdam to speak to us. Catherine Perez-Shakdam is the co-founder and Director of Forward Strategy and a Research Fellow at the American Center for Levant Studies. She's a prominent expert in the Middle East and played an important role in shaping policy decisions, specifically regarding Yemen's war. And she's best known for infiltrating the Islamic Republic of Iran and reaching the regime's highest echelons. She holds an MA in Finance and an MA in Communications from the University of London. So I'm going to ask Catherine now to speak to us for 15 minutes, and then we'll have time, and she's agreed to take questions and answers. Catherine, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. First of all, I'm really appreciative of the invitation. I'm very glad to speak for Middle East Forum. It's a privilege. And today I'd like to discuss Iran's modus operandi and what I believe has been so far a failures on the part of our Western capitals when it comes to handling the threat coming out of the Islamic Republic of Iran. As you mentioned, I've infiltrated a few years back the regime. It took me about 10 years. And throughout these 10 years, I've come to know quite closely the regime modus operandi, the way that its narrative, its desire to not only infiltrate countries and expand its ideology, because the one thing that I want people to understand very clearly, and I think this is something that all politicians and state officials have missed, is that the Islamic Republic ideology is not limited to the border of Iran, but very much geared toward export. And their aim, however foolish and insane it may sound to people, is actually towards world domination. And I know exactly how it sounds. It's very difficult for rational people to comprehend that some ideologues sitting in Tehran have this ambition to force the rest of the world to adopt their way of thinking, their worldview, and to eventually take knee to the leadership of Iran, which is, the mullahs of Iran, and live under a model that would be somewhat similar to that of the Islamic Republic. Now, if you look at the history, since 1979, Iran has managed to infiltrate and break, I would say, several Arab capitals. So obviously Beirut, Lebanon. You have Damascus, Syria, Sana'a, Yemen, and Iraq with Baghdad. We know that to be true. And now they form this axis of resistance. And where I think we missed the mark is that every time that Iran has infiltrated a country, starting with Lebanon, then Iraq, then Syria, then Yemen, they have operated in the same fashion. So you have different iteration of how they go about doing things, because obviously every country has its own idiosyncrasies. They have their own political setup. They have their own demographic when it comes to, religious minorities and where they sit on the political spectrum. But every single time, Iran has practiced what I call the boiling of the frog, which is they found fault lines within those particular countries. And they exploited those fault lines, understanding the political makeup, the social makeup, playing religious tension to try to infiltrate themselves, to try to create crisis that they would then find a solution for, present themselves as the saviors, and a lot of the time positioning themselves against Western powers by blaming a lot of the problem that those particular countries were suffering from on Western capitals, to formulate this notion that Islam is at war with the West, that there is a clash of civilization, and that the West is the enemy. And when I say the West, obviously, one of the main enemy of the Islamic Republic of Iran is Israel, the Zionist entity, as Ayatollah Khamenei likes to call Israel. Why is this important? Is that today we felt, and I think that is still true today, and I think it's folly on our part to not understand just the danger that we actually under, is that all Western capitals are next in line for infiltration. And you can see this quite clearly in all the ways for the past 40 years, all the many ways that Iran has committing acts of terror through proxies or even directly. And you could see this, for example, with the arrest a few years back of an Iranian diplomat in Belgium that was actually accused and convicted of an act of terror, and who is now, following a lot of manipulation by the state of Iran and a lot of threats against Belgium, has now been freed and allowed to return to Iran to continued to his prison sentence, but was actually made free by the Ayatollah. So the way that Iran operated was quite simply to apply immense pressure on Belgium and to force Belgium to concede to its wishes. And this is this is insane to think that, it could happen, but it has happened systematically time and time again. You see this again today with Sweden. There was the burning of the Quran. Iran, in my mind, it is very likely that Iran actually orchestrated the burning of the Quran to then position Sweden, I would say, on the back foot and accuse Sweden of acting against the best interests of its Muslim communities and Islam in general. And Iran is actually forcing Sweden to violate its free speech and freedom of religion by forcing it to ban the burning of the Quran. And this is not me making an apology for an act, what I believe is an act of violence and an act of stupidity, if I can call it that. But it's forcing us to reinvent and reframe our democratic principles. And those are attacks against our national sovereignty, I believe. And this has been done every time to the point where we feel that there is a threat, we understand that there is a problem, but we don't have, I would say, the moral standing to draw a line and decide that no more, that we will not cede any more ground. But Iran knows exactly who we are, what we do, how we operate, and our desire to not militarily intervene against Iran. They know that we don't have a stomach for war anymore after the failures of Afghanistan and Iraq, and that it can push and push and push the envelope further and further away without all Western capitals being able to draw a line in the sand and actually make a stand on this line and say, we will not concede anymore. We will act against you and hold you accountable for the crimes that you have committed, not only against our people, our national sovereignty and our democratic principles, but that of you people. Because we have to understand something that is very important, is that everything that Iran is saying, and when I say Iran, I'm talking about the regime, in terms of acting as a protector of the Palestinians, or at least acting in their benefit, in acting as a guardian and savior for religious minority, is not true. And the best way to see this is the way that Iran is actually conducting itself against its own minorities within its borders. When you see that Iran was quite happy to slaughter Palestinians in Iraq when it could, when you see how many Baha'i Jews and Christians have been oppressed by virtue of their religious differences within the borders of Iran, when you see the way that the Kurds have been systematically discriminated against, Baluch, Azeris within the border of Iran, and yet we continue to believe that we can somewhat appease and contain the ambitions of the Islamic Republic. And when I say we, I'm talking about our Western capitals. But everything has failed. We have tried with the JCPOA. We have been sold the idea and the notion that we could, against the promise of a return to the fold of the international community, that Iran could be welcomed back in again, against concession on its nuclear program. And we have seen that it has failed. And every single time, Iran has positioned itself as a victim of Western manipulation, of the Zionist manipulation, saying that Israel was the enemy, America was the enemy. And the regime has conducted a dual language where it is being very belligerent, very aggressive in its rhetoric on the public scene, on social media, on television, in the news, in the media, attacking us, threatening us with war, saying that we would never bow, we will always, attack, we will develop our military capacity, we can attack Tel Aviv, we can attack Western capitals. And yet our state officials, in response to those threats, which are very, very serious threats, have continued to believe and to sell us the idea that they can contain, that Iran is not a threat, that no, they will not carry out, those acts of war that they're talking about, that this is just, for show, this is just for the media. It is not for the media. If you look at the way that, Lebanon has been turned into a void, it's a failed state, more or less. Hezbollah is running the show. People are suffering. State institutions are not viable. If you see the way that Iraq is suffering and not able to actually choose its own laws, that things are being imposed on government officials, and if they do not comply with the wishes of Tehran, they could potentially be put to death. When you see that Yemen is undergoing the biggest humanitarian crisis in its history, and potentially in our modern history, in terms of the famine and the diseases and the death that the Houthi continue to perpetuate, something needs to change. And in my mind, where we miss the mark is that we have failed to understand and study the ideology of the regime, its modus operandi, how it operates within our borders, the many outposts that the RSGC has planted in the UK, in France, in Germany, in Sweden, in the US, and it goes on and on and on. And what worries me today, and I will finish with this, is the fact that we know today that now Iran has more and more capacity. Its naval capacity has become a threat to the Strait of Hormuz. And we know, you know as well as I do, that the second that Iran can control the world oil route, we would have an energy crisis. If you look at the way that Russia has conducted itself with Ukraine and the way that it has bullied Western capitals into compliance to the point where it felt bold enough to invade Ukraine, we went through an energy crisis. So they're applying they're using the same threat, but we haven't learned anything at all. And Iran today could potentially attack the Strait of Hormuz and exert control over the world oil route. A few days ago, an RSGC commander came out saying that Iran wanted to control the Panama Canal. We know today that the RSGC has sent agents to Latin America to try to bring around several capitals in Latin America to its ideology, the notion that America was a problem. So this is not just a regional problem that is limited to the MENA region today. This is a problem that has been exported south of America's border that could potentially, in a couple of years, become a real problem for America. But America has fooled itself thinking that it could contain because it failed to appreciate the real threat that the mullahs in Iran represented, not just for the region, the MENA region and its strategic interests, but its survival itself. And I feel today, and I don't like to be dramatic, but I've seen and heard the regime's ideologues. I've not seen their plan, but I've spoken to them and they explain what is it that they wanted. Everything that they have said was going to happen has happened. And I've written about it quite a lot, specifically in regards to the threat to the Jewish diaspora and the mapping out that we know today is true. For a long time, people were trying to brush it under the rug. We know this to be true. So when people like me and other experts are coming forward and warning of the dangers, I think that it would be fair for state officials in the US and across the EU and the UK to actually pay attention and understand that unless they formulate a clear strategy and draw a line in the sand and stand by it, we are at war. But we're not doing anything to defend ourselves, our people, our democracy, and our democracy are fragile. We know this. I mean, Churchill said it better than I could. But democracy is a very fine, there's a fine balance to find. And unless we do something today, I'm afraid that in a couple of years, we won't remember and we will not recognize who we are anymore.
Thank you very much, Catherine. A number of questions have come in. The first one I will read out to you is from Leonard Sand, and he says the following: very good. So how do we push back short of military conflict, or indeed is military conflict inevitable?
It's a very good question. Look, I'm not an advocate of war because I think that, several things need to happen before. But the one thing I would say is that we need to do two things. Number one is to actually understand that we have regional partners in the Middle East that could help. And we're not alone in this fight. Saudi Arabia, Israel, Jordan, Iraq, many countries understand today, Syria, understand that the Islamic Republic has become a problem for them. When I talk about Syria, I'm not talking about the regime of Syria. I'm actually talking about the Syrian opposition, of course. People are trying, and countries want to get from under the Islamic Republic. They have lived under the shadow of the Islamic Republic for decades. They understand the threats. They have lived it. They've seen their country being transformed into a failed state, and they don't want this anymore. The problem, I feel, is that we have failed to actually stand by the alliances that we have brokered in the MENA region, and we have abandoned a lot of our strategic partners. And this is a failure on our part because now you can see how Saudi Arabia is slowly shifting toward China and Russia for the simple reason that it's not that suddenly discovered that Russia and China were friendlier, is that we have failed to stand by the security threat that Saudi Arabia was facing. And faced with isolation, Saudi Arabia decided to do what was best for Saudi Arabia, which was to find elsewhere the promise of a friendship and an alliance that would be committed to its defense because America failed, because the UK failed, because the EU failed to actually fill that gap. And that's lesson number one. We could also, sanctions are actually quite good. And I'm talking about real sanction. I'm not talking about, the sanction that closes one door and leaves the window open so that Iran could continue to sell its oil, so that Iran could find ways and means, to bypass sanctions. I'm talking about hardcore sanctions that would be applied all the time and people held accountable should they violate them. I'm talking about mapping out the RSJC so that we would understand exactly how far this infiltration that we know is happening right now in our Western capitals has gone on for, who is responsible, exactly what area, whether it's academia, whether it's our NGOs, whether it's our media, how far does the rabbit hole goes. We need to have an assessment. We need to be able to identify what we're looking at to be able to devise strategies. So I don't have a one answer, but what I would say is this, is to stand by our democratic principles, to stand in solidarity with Iranians at home when they're telling us that they want to get rid of the regime, to find ways within the region to apply solutions that would enable people in Iran to free themselves from the regime and find solutions that would work for them. I'm not talking about military interventionism. I'm not talking about exporting our version of democracy. I'm talking about empowering a people to decide what the future would look like for them and accompany them in this journey, not tell them what to do. When we do this, when we listen to people who are living under the threat of the Islamic Republic, then we will be able to protect ourselves, by association. And I think that's the best way forward. But first, we have to recognize that Iran is an enemy. And two, we have to have stronger sanctions and make sure that they apply all the time systematically.
Thanks. Another question comes from Lev Titrin, who asks the following: the regime of the Ayatollahs is rooted in Islamist ideology. So this seems to be the natural place to start, namely to debunk Islamism, which Lev suggests is easy given that no one can possibly know whether God talked to Muhammad. And yet this is exactly what we in the West are avoiding. This is irrational. And he asks, why do we avoid debunking Islamism as such?
I'm really glad that this question was posed because it is a problem. So Iran has been very clever, again, at playing our democratic principles, the idea that we want to exercise free religion. We want to give people free speech. We want to make sure that their rights as individuals and within their communities are respected. And we know that for the past, I would say, 20 to 30 years, the word Islamophobia has become a thing that has been exploited and utilized, in my mind, as a weapon against people who came in criticism of, Islamic radicalism. So whenever people want to discuss the issue of Islamism and the fact that radicalism is actually a reality, not just in the Middle East, but across Muslim communities and, of course, in the West, those people have been accused of being Islamophobic, xenophobic, racist, sectarian. And usually the dialogue ends there, where people are being attacked, they're being labeled, they are forced to retreat because obviously they're being attacked, and people I would say, are quite quick to judge. And rather than offend, they prefer to appease, because we live in a society today where offending someone is a crime, which I think is quite ridiculous. People have every right to be offended. I don't think that we should stop criticizing and debating certain ideas on the basis that we might offend someone. I think that offending someone is a right within our democracy that is quite healthy, and people need to learn how to get over it. Now, in the case of Islamism, again, because Islamist ideologues have been quite violent when they disagree with certain criticisms, or when they are being accused of war crimes or committing even crimes against humanity, I think there's a lot of cowardice that has taken place and taken root. People have been so worried to lose their political base, should they actually stand and say that there is an issue within Islam, not as a religion, but in that it has been infiltrated by agents who are utilizing Islam and turning it into a weapon to serve their own agenda that have nothing to do with Islamic principles, by the way. And there's a very clear difference The problem is people tend to say, oh, you can't talk about Islam, you can't talk about Muslim because you are labeling them. No, we're talking about a very small minority. The problem is this minority is gaining so much ground that they're redefining the way that people think themselves Muslim and the way that they're practicing and operating within the world. And they feel that they exist in opposition to Western society. And you could see this in France, you could see this, in Germany, and we don't know what to do because we have failed to identify and actually, I would say, create the right words and the right narrative in terms of making clear that Islam is not the same thing as Islamism, that it is one thing to advocate for free speech and freedom of religion. It's another to actually advocate for genocide, that it's another to advocate for the submission and oppression of women on the basis of that. If people come into our countries and our laws do not stand in, I would say, in alignment with their belief system, our laws needs to stand. And I know this is hard for people to actually, agree to, but you can't expect our Western democracy to reinvent themselves on the basis that a few people, a minority, wishes to change everything and our tradition, who we are, where we come from, our history, on the basis of an ideology that they themselves agree that they've run away from to come here to the West and try to reinvent it. We need to understand that this is the dichotomy, that there's something that is wrong, and that maybe those people actually have an agenda. And again, I'm not painting, immigrants under one brush. Most Muslims actually have suffered tremendously from Islamic radicalism. And I would say that our duty and the way that we could exercise and demonstrate freedom of religion is actually standing on behalf of those people, those Muslim communities who want to live freely and who have suffered the most by the hands of radicals. And this is something that we need to call on our state officials to actually stand for and talk about, and to stop to run away. So I would say a bit of more fortitude would be most welcome. And we need to stop being scared of everything. And we need to say things the way they are. And if people have an issue with or they get offended, that's the risk that we take.
Thanks for that. So this next question maybe is a good way to follow up from that, given you talking about the need for courage. It relates to your own personal story and experiences. It's from Andrew Rosemarine, who describes himself as an international lawyer. And he asks, if what you say is true, why hasn't Iran assassinated you?
Well, I hope they don't. That's all I'm going to say.
We hope so too.
I'm not Iranian. I'm not Iranian. Again, Iran has a very, very clear way of, operating, and Iranian are actually in the line of fire more than anyone else. It doesn't mean that I'm not on the list somewhere. It doesn't mean that, if I was to travel to certain countries, I wouldn't be kidnapped. It happens all the time. We have seen it with a scholar from Princeton University who was kidnapped while conducting a study in Iraq. She was abducted by a proxy group that is actually working for the Islamic Republic of Iran on the basis that she's Jewish and Israeli, even though she has a Russian passport as well. So it is very possible. Also, I mean, I don't mean to be offensive, but I think it's a little bit silly to just assume that because I'm still breathing and standing that everything that I say might not be true. You need people to actually go there on the field and act as witness to certain things. And millions of people, I mean, not millions of people, but many people have done what I've done, maybe not in the same way, but when you have Iranians who are actually speaking up and speaking out against the regime, putting everything on the line, some of them are still alive, and thankfully so. If the regime was killing everyone, that would be a problem. And I'm not saying that they're not trying to, but what I'm saying is that some people manage to break through, and for whatever reason, they decide to not target everyone. I also live in the UK, so I believe that we have a very healthy intelligence services, and our authority are quite capable of protecting its citizen. Several people in the UK that are much higher profile than me are also on the list somewhere. They're still breathing too, and they continue to speak against the Islamic Republic. So we need to nurture those voices. We need to give the platforms. They are important, and it's not. In my case, it's not a question of courage. It was more a matter of witnessing the evil of the Islamic Republic, and I want to emphasize on the word evil because I don't think that people grasp just how nefarious the ideology that it projects is. I could not just witness it and do nothing about it. And so I did what I could, which wasn't much, in the bigger scheme of things. But yeah, thankfully I'm still breathing, and I will do so for quite some time.
We hope so too. Last question, probably, and perhaps an apt one from Mehrdad Hansari, who I assume from his name is himself also an Iranian, asks the following. In the past 44 years, all that you have said has consistently reverberated, albeit with less intensity by many quarters. Yet there's been no will to pay the price for standing up to Iran. Do you believe that Western leaders don't understand the problem, or do they simply not wish to commit in a decisive way?
I think there are several things to this. And look, this is just my understanding of the situation, and people may disagree. I do believe that, number one, yes, there's been a thorough misunderstanding, and I think it stems from the fact that we had a very particular strategy when it came to dealing with Soviet Russia, for example, and containment and appeasement worked to some extent. I mean, people may argue with this, but it more or less worked in terms of avoiding a nuclear confrontation, at least. And so we tried to replicate this with the Islamic Republic of Iran, not understanding that, the Islamic Republic is a very different beast altogether. It's not Soviet Russia. Again, its ideology is geared towards export in the way that Soviet Russia wasn't. Soviet Russia understood that it had geographical limitation. The Islamic Republic doesn't. It wants to invade everybody and everything. And if not, it wants to make sure that you're in a position to acquiesce and not defend yourself against it. So there's that. Also, I do believe that there's a certain fear, and I think I would say more over the past decade, that normalization with the state of Israel has become a reality, even though the US has pushed for it. So I know that what I'm saying might sound a little bit counterintuitive, but I do think that there's been a realization in some quarters that should normalization actually happen on a global scale with the Middle East, that the Middle East might not need America just as much, or Western capital. Because if you look at the natural resources and the way that the region has gone, I mean, the trajectory that it is engaged on, regardless of the advances of the Islamic Republic, is pretty positive. And so I do believe that there's a desire to somewhat maintain a certain threat over the MENA region, so that America would still be, the go-to in terms of protection, that the region would not emancipate further and then become less of an ally and more of a challenger to America's authority, or at least domination over world markets. This is my own read on the situation, but I think there's a little bit of this there, because again, if you look at the many natural resources, if you look at the way that Saudi Arabia quite literally exploded onto the scene and became a powerhouse, if you put Israel into the mix of this and they suddenly become ally and work together, the region will be pretty much unstoppable in a very positive way. And I hope that it happens. I really do. I think it's time for the MENA region to emancipate and to come onto its own, quite simply.
We're coming towards the end. I do want to leave time for one more question, nevertheless, though, which is quite a specific one. Larry Greenberg asks, why shouldn't Western navies selectively govern the flow of exports from the Persian Gulf? He's suggesting, in a sense, a naval blockade, given the presence, of course, of the Fifth Fleet there in the Gulf and so on, the more active use of that.
It's a good question. Well, for one, international law, I would say, and you would have to do that in accordance with, the countries who do govern the region. So, of course, you have international waters, so you can make an argument for that. But, you would have to have a discussion with Kuwait, the UAE, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and make sure that, those countries actually are in agreement. This is the thing about, respecting a country's national sovereignty. You have to speak to them. You can't just dictate. And I think that we have lost a lot of our credibility in terms of our desire to stand by, because it is one thing to want to defend the world all route for our own interest. It's another, to say to Saudi Arabia, well, let us use your waters and let us, police that stretch of water. But should harm come to you, we won't really lift a finger. So again, we have to treat people fairly on equal footing as partners. Not as subjects that we want to rule over. So I think that if we were to change the way that we talk to people and engage with them, maybe we will, whatever we say would resonate better.
Thank you for that. Catherine, it's been a very fascinating discussion, rather short, unfortunately. If it was up to me, I'd happily carry it on for another half an hour, but these sessions are intended to last half an hour. We've come to the end of that. So thank you very much for agreeing to take part. Obviously, an issue of huge importance. Here at the Middle East Forum, in the webinars, we try and deal week after week with issues of similar importance and hopefully a discussion on a similar level. So I hope people will continue to tune in. We hope to hear much more from you, Catherine, also in the future. And thanks to everybody for tuning in today. Thanks and bye for now.
Bye.